thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to have Jack and from William Buck joining the webinar today. And also we've got Brendan from the Cake team, who's based in Melbourne, joining as well. I've got Teela online, who's part of the community team as well. The main attraction today is going to be Jack and Brendan, and they're going to be talking about everything to do with the employee share schemes, particularly once you actually transition from the startup concessions into a more mature business that either for one of the reasons you don't qualify for the startup concessions. What are your options then in terms of actually continuing to tap into employee incentive schemes? What are the different structures that people actually look at? What are some of the tax consequences of that? And that's very fairly and squarely in Jack's ballpark, so he'll be actually covering off some great content on that and some of the things to actually look out on as you're actually going through that journey. We'll also be actually talking. Brendan spends a lot of his time helping later stage companies, some of who are still using the ESS concession, but a lot of them are out of it. And so Brendan will also be actually talking about what are some of the practical considerations outside of just the scheme structures and then also the taxation implications, but what are some of the other things he's seeing, particularly later stage companies wanting to address as they're going through this journey. So things like valuations and things like that. So I think we've got a great combination of topics here. We will start by covering off a little bit. Jack will cover off a little bit to do with the startup concessions. So if you are earlier stage, we'll still cover off a little bit of that as well. We're aiming to run the presentation for around about 45 minutes, and then we'll actually move into Q&A afterwards. And then, you'll be able to actually access a recording of this post the event. And obviously, I'm sure Jack and Brendan are more than happy to actually connect with you offline as well. So I'll hand over to Jack maybe for bit more thorough intro, and then Brendan, I'll let you guys take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Cal. Hey, everyone. For those that haven't met me yet, I'm Jack, partner at William Buck, a mid-sized accounting firm. We work with a lot of tech startups and scale-ups, and employee share scheme is one of the things I enjoy talking about. So I hope to give some useful insights today. So look, I think I will just share my screen. So give me one sec. Okay, everyone can see that? Can everyone see the slides?
We can.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. So, so this is an overview on the things I'll be talking about today. So I'll give you a little bit of background on the Australian ESS tax rules. What's so good about the startup concession? What are the conditions, which are the same reasons why companies fall outside of eligibility? And obviously the juicy bit about some alternatives to the startup concession, as well as some other observations and considerations there. Okay. So look, as a background, so the tax rules under the startup concession falls under Division 83A of the Tax Act, and the tax liability falls on the employee, not the employer. Okay, so so I'm just trying to fit all the slides. The employee is taxed on the discount to market value on those shares or rights, including share options, that are received in relation to their employment. And there usually is an amount included in the employee's assessable income and taxed at individual marginal tax rates. However, the timing and the amount of the liability depends on various factors, including the nature of the employer, the nature of the share scheme, and circumstances of the employee. But the default position, just bear in mind, is that it's a tax on the employee on the discount to market value included in their assessable income. Okay, so that's the default position unless there is some kind of tax concession available. Now, what's so good about the startup concession? Well, it's as the name implies, it is highly concessional, highly desirable because there is no tax upon grant of the shares or rights, including options. There's no tax upon vesting, no tax upon exercise if it's share options. So the tax is payable only upon the disposal of the shares or options, which is as late as you realistically can achieve, right? So because you want to defer the taxing point, and I can't imagine deferring the taxing point beyond the sale of the shares or options. And another benefit is that the entire gain is taxable on the capital account, which means you could get the benefit of the 50% capital gains tax concession if the shares or options are held for at least 12 months. And if it's shares, then the period holding the options count towards that 12 months as well. So you could, in theory, hold on to eligible share options and exercise them and turn them into shares a day before you sell them. And you could still get the 50% CGT discount because your period holding the share options has exceeded the usual 12 months period required. So yes, that is quite generous and you want that. Okay, so then this is why it's a big deal in situations where companies fall outside of the startup concession. So it's not a good thing for the participants unless a new solution is found. So here's an overview of the concessions for startup concession for options. It's overview of the conditions for startup concession in the case of options. Now, I won't go through every single one of those, but you can see that there's company level conditions, scheme level conditions, and employee level conditions. Now, I will point out that the most relevant ones on this list are if the requirement that companies in the whole group, not just the head company, but companies in the whole group are all incorporated for less than 10 years, measured as at the most recent financial year end. So realistically, you get slightly more than 10 years. But basically, that is a common reason why startup concession eligibility ends. Okay, time flies. Believe it or not, it was 1 July 2015 that the startup concession was first introduced. So, exactly almost 10 years ago. So that is a common reason. Now, another less common reason, but I still see from time to time, is the aggregated turnover, i.e. the revenue for the whole group exceeds the $50 million ceiling. Okay. So in the most recently concluded income year. So that's a really good problem to have for the company. Okay. So if the company has grown a lot, it's less than 10 years, but exceeded the $50 million turnover, then there is no more startup concession. So that is a good problem to have, and you sometimes see that. Okay. Now, another thing worth me pointing out is employee level conditions, the last one. Where there is employee holding more than 10% of shares or voting rights on an as diluted basis, i.e. options are treated as if they get voting rights, even though they don't in real life, then the participant also do not get the startup concession, okay? And this is a common problem with founders, and this equally applies even if the founders hold the shares or options in their family trust, because it's all included anyway. Okay. And this is why today's session is also relevant for founders wanting additional equities in startups. Okay. So those founders might be interested in what we're discussing today, even though their startup is still eligible for the startup concession, because everyone else might be eligible for the startup concession, but the founder might not be. Okay. So they might need the similar solutions as some of the other other situations that we're going to be talking about. So let's talk about the alternatives. So you're no longer eligible for the startup concession. What alternatives do you have? Let's talk about the first one, the most obvious one, which is taxed upfront. So this can be applied to shares or options. Employees basically taxed upon the issue of those shares or options. Okay, and remember, this is the default option under the Division 83A Tax Act. So usually not ideal, because there's a cash flow burden for the employee, because they're paying tax now on what is essentially an illiquid asset, because ultimately startups and scale-ups are not liquid companies. There's no readily available market for their shares. So it's not like people can just sell down a portion to pay for the tax liability. No such luck. So, you've got a cash flow burden here, but the reason this is even discussed as a potential alternative is that this actually might be okay in some situations where the market value of the shares or options is low and you can justify it, right? You can't just go, oh, it's low, then it's all good. Well, you have to be able to justify it and support it in the event of questions from the tax office. But if you can support it, then being taxed up front on shares worth $5, it might be a decent outcome because you enter the capital gains tax regime from that point onwards, i.e. future upside potentially taxed at half the usual tax rate because of the 50% CGT discount. Okay, so that is one alternative. Now, the next alternative is So the next alternative is the tax-deferred option schemes, which usually it is to do with options. You can make it shares, although shares are harder to satisfy these conditions. Okay, so usually what I see it is options. So what this is tax deferred until a future point in time, with the basically the taxing point being the earliest of where there is no risk of forfeiture and no restriction on employee disposing of the shares or options. And another deferred taxing point is 15 years after the employee acquires the shares or options. Okay, so just note that there was a cessation of employment as a taxing point previously, but that's now removed. So that's no longer a taxing point. Just because someone leaves their job does not of itself make that a taxing point. Okay, so really the most relevant taxing points are when there's no risk of forfeiture and no restrictions on disposal, or 15 years after the acquisition, whichever occurs earlier. Okay, so if you tweak this, there's an opportunity to structure the scheme so that the tax is deferred until maybe after a certain amount of time has elapsed, or upon a successful exit event, which in that instance, it's a decent result from a timing perspective because at that point, the participant can service the tax liability. Okay. So the conditions for tax deferred schemes, what are they? So there need to be shares, ordinary shares, or options relating to ordinary shares. Okay. The employees can't hold more than 10% of the shares or voting rights of the company on an as diluted basis. We touched on this previously. There needs to be a real risk of forfeiture, or if there is no real risk of forfeiture, there needs to be genuine disposal restrictions on the shares or options. And the documents of the plan rules must refer to deferred taxation. Okay, so what I typically see is there is a real risk of forfeiture that gets people into this. Okay, now, and then the employee is taxed on the discounted market value at the deferred taxing point. So recall the earliest of no longer real risk of forfeiture or disposal restrictions, or the 15-year mark. So the advantage of this type of scheme is, you defer tax, which, very good from a timing perspective. The disadvantage is the market value and therefore the assessable discount may be significantly higher at the deferred taxing point because a lot of the time, some time has elapsed. Another disadvantage is most or all of the upside is going to be taxed at marginal personal tax rates, i.e. no 50% general capital gains tax discount, okay, most of the time. And another disadvantage is option holders, they can't participate in dividends until they exercise, which, is, to be fair to this type of scheme, is similar to a startup concession ESOP anyway, okay? So the third alternative is a limited recourse loan share plan or loan share plan. That's another name that gets used. Now, people this has been around for a long time. Okay, a lot of people have a lot of experience using this, and it's a little bit clunky, but guess what? It works. So that's why it's still around, and it's absolutely a legitimate alternative once people fall outside the startup concession. So the way it works is the employee acquires the shares at full market value, i.e. they buy it at full market value. So there is no discount on acquisition, so no tax problem under 83A of the Tax Act. However, the consideration is funded by a loan from the employer. So the employee doesn't need to reach into his or her pockets, and basically they just get shares, they get an asset, and they get a liability at the same time. What this does is it replicates the economic substance of a share option, whereby the strike price of the share option equals today's market value. Okay, so employees participate on future upside in the capital value. The recourse on the loan is limited to the value of the shares, i.e. there's no risk to the employee other than losing the shares. So the company can't come after the employee and say, you have to pay this loan now, okay? And if you can't pay, I'm going to take your other assets, I'm going to take you to court. It doesn't work like that. The worst case scenario is the employee just simply loses their shares, okay? So that's why it's called a limited recourse loan. The loan is usually repayable upon a future sale of the shares, and because they're shares from day one, employees could get dividends if the company is profit making. But obviously, a lot of tech startups and scale-ups, well, vast majority are not profit making. But if there are dividends, the dividends can be used to pay against the loan liability. So let's compare limited recourse loan versus tax deferred share schemes, because those two are often compared against each other. All right. So the advantage is tax. This is from the perspective of limited recourse loan. The advantage is tax is payable once, only upon the sale of the shares. Any gain on the sale, any upside, is subject to the 50% capital gains tax discount, provided the shares are held for more than 12 months. There's no cash flow burden, as tax liability is usually linked with a liquidity event. And despite the initial loan liability, the overall upside on an after-tax basis may be higher if the value of the shares increase significantly over time. So in other words, the tax saving far outweighs the liability of the loan. Okay, so whether it does or it doesn't is situation specific. But basically, the idea is that if the value of the shares if the value of shares increases a lot over time, then maybe a limited recourse loan will result in a better after-tax outcome. The disadvantages of limited recourse loan, well, there is a loan liability. Technically from day one, you don't have an upside, whereas for tax deferred share option schemes, you're able to set the option exercise price at really low. Okay, so it could be like 1 cent, for example. Okay, so another disadvantage is, well, from the perspective of the startup or scale up, is the employee becomes shareholders from day one, which means they get the usual voting, dividend, and information rights. Shareholders are generally harder to manage than option holders. It's not ideal for existing shareholders, and because of this ugly tax rule called Division 7A, and it's difficult to issue multiple tranches. Okay, but there may be ways around it if it can be argued that the company has no distributable surplus, which roughly means retained profits. And that is an argument that can be mounted, obviously, for a lot of startups and scale-ups. It is situation specific, though, so you really do need to think about this issue when it comes to existing shareholders. There are various personal tax issues to consider in a share buyback and cancellation scenario. We're not going to go through a lot of details, but it's a lot more fiddly to buy back and cancel shares compared to cancelling share options. Another disadvantage I'll mention is it generally limits the ability for the participant to hold the shares through a related entity, i.e. family trust, because of FBT, fringe benefits tax limitations. We won't go into that. Just know that that is usually an issue that results in the participant holding the shares in their own name instead. The fourth alternative, and this is very much something that's relevant for senior management, is this thing called indeterminate rights. Okay, so what is that? So it's a right to receive an unspecified number of shares, or a right to receive shares or cash, depending on the company's discretion. Okay, so the tax law goes, well, if you don't know what exactly you're going to receive, we won't tax you yet. Okay, so we'll tax you potentially down the track when the picture becomes clearer. So if it's settled in equity, i.e. shares or options, you go back and amend the prior year tax return in the year of grant. You treat it as if it's always been a ESS interest, and whatever is the taxing point is worked out according to that particular assumption. It could be in the year of grant, it could be some other time, but basically you go back and amend your prior year tax returns when the picture becomes clearer. If it's settled in cash, then that's quite simple. It's just an ordinary PAYG, okay? And superannuation provisions will apply. So the pros and cons now, the advantage is, you can defer tax to the liquidity event if you structure it right. The disadvantages are, complex. It is complex. It needs to be structured carefully. A lot of parameters to consider. There's the inherent uncertainty associated with this, because that's the whole name. That's the whole nature of this particular solution. It's indeterminate. So there is some uncertainty there, and it's inherent. And it's harder to obtain the 50% capital gains tax discount. I say harder, not impossible. Okay. So you can see there's a bit of complexities there. Now, the fifth alternative is what's known as premium priced share options, where participants are issued share options, and depending on the expiry date of the share options, i.e. the window in which someone must exercise their options, turn them into shares, depending on that, and the option exercise price is high enough such that the tax law says, right, you receive something, but we're going to treat it as if it's worth nothing at all for tax purposes. Therefore, you do not have a tax liability. So you can see from this table here the various parameters to get to that nil outcome in the last column. Okay, so that is something worth considering. Exercise price may be high, but it could work out very well if the share price moves upwards significantly, and I've definitely seen that. But it does require the share price to go up for this to make sense. Okay, other considerations. Some traps here that I see all the time. So this is more of a general comment. It's not specifically related to startup concession or any of those alternatives. So, but it's something worth just quickly discussing. Company contractors being issued shares or options, they don't get a lot of the tax concessions under the Division 83A. So this is situations where for example, a digital developer is contracting to the company directly and building a particular product, or a consultant consulting through a company to the startup, and that he or she receives shares or options relating to that consulting arrangement. Well, they don't get the concessions under the ESS tax rules, because the original relationship was between a company and another company. Okay, whereas Division 83A applies to individuals. Okay. Another trap I see all the time is founders trying to access various ESS tax concessions. We spoke about the 10% ceiling. People forget it all the time. Founders participate thinking that they're able to get the concessions, then find out with rude shock that they don't get it. Another trap is promises made but not actioned until much later, when the market values are much higher and the tax problem is much bigger. Another thing is using cheap or free ESOP templates, e.g. from the ATO. Don't do it. Like, just pay a lawyer to do it properly. You get what you pay for, and if you pay nothing for it, then what you get can be rubbish a lot of the time. People forget annual ATO reporting. Okay, so this needs to be reported on an annual basis. It's amazing the number of startups and their tax agents who aren't aware of this. And also there is a payroll tax liability if the startup or scale up exceeds the payroll tax threshold. Now, some tips. So number one, make sure it's tax effective. I think I'm preaching to the converter here. Another tip is have clear vesting criteria. Time-based vesting is good, so make it nice and clear. Don't overcomplicate things unless you have to. Have the right option exercise price to drive the right kind of behavior. Is it market value at the issue time, or is it as low as possible to compensate people for below market salaries? That is a case-by-case basis. Have the right good and bad lever provisions. And consider accelerated vesting in a change of control or an exit event. Okay, so that is that QR code is to my LinkedIn, I believe. So people with any questions, please feel free to reach out afterwards. And that's my section. Over to you, Brendan.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Jack. That was really good, really informative. And so, yeah, I think that Jack really provides a great overview of all the different ESS structures for companies transitioning off the startup concession. And yeah, I'd like to provide at least some practical advice from where do we go in terms of next steps for companies. How do we use this information productively to set up a new plan? And so I'm going to show you do a presentation here on the practical guide for you. And so, yeah, some of the question really is, how should you transition from startup concession? And there's really kind of three key steps, at least we experience when people come to Cake. Amend and create the new plan. So that would be working with Jack to choose the plan, formulate it, working with legal counsel to create it. Looking with an eye towards structuring it for international scaling. Definitely companies that are AU based, they're reaching the point where they're looking to go global, and just making sure that it's structured appropriately. And then also, as Jack alluded to, around and Ivan mentioned in the comments, around determining the valuation of the options or the shares, and how best to go about that, because there's different approaches. And so, yeah, just to kind of recap, in terms of the non-startup concessional ESS plan types that are available, Jack just went through all of them. To give you some context for us in terms of what are the most common and one of the ones which are the most interesting to kind of take a look at, definitely deferred option schemes is a common one. And then, yeah, limited recourse loans or loan back share schemes are pretty popular as well. But ultimately, all five of these definitely have a place. We have companies on Cake that all have all these different types, and it's definitely a use case-by-case basis. But in terms of what it looks like to transition from being a startup, having a plan now, the plan's set up under the startup concession, that's the way it's written, the way it's structured. The usual approach is to explore alternative structures. So start talking with Jack and others, create and configure the new plan. And then in terms of the old plan is to close and preserve it as a legacy plan. And so all of the grants that have been issued as part of that, the vesting conditions associated, et cetera, they will all continue. And then issuing out new grants would all come, and future grants would all come from the new plan. And so that's the general roadmap for companies looking to get off the startup concession. There is the potential, and we do have a lot of clients who will amend their startup concession-based plan. But generally speaking, it'll be the trigger point for, as Jack mentioned, for switching off startup concession is going to be 10 years or some other trigger. And normally that's the length of the option plan anyway. So there's kind of already a need to start fresh for the company. And but yeah, you can potentially amend. And then to give you some context on valuations. So being under the startup concession, it's great that you're able to do an NTA valuation to determine the strike price on the options or the tax basis on the shares that you're granting your employees. But at that point, you're having the accounting team or you're doing it internally, and it's nice and easy. But once you get off that startup concession, you no longer can do that in most cases. And so at that point, you've got a couple of options. Like Ivan mentioned, how do we do the valuation? One is to take a look at the latest fundraising round, assuming that that's kind of occurred in the previous kind of 6 to 12 months, and just use that as the fair market value. That's what a lot of our companies do. But generally speaking, it's not as beneficial to the employee because that's the rate that was kind of pushed to, or at least sold to the investors, so to speak. And so it's very forward-looking. It's very optimistic, and so the valuation is going to be a little bit higher than what could be the case if you actually just looked at the business model and looked at the business's actual numbers. And so the alternative to that, and what a lot of companies will do, is actually have an independent valuation done by a firm to determine the valuation of the company. So not a net tangible asset valuation, but a more formal valuation. And that's something that Kate can help through our preferred partner network. We can introduce you to the best firms and people. Jack's firm is an example of one that does, to come up with a formal valuation that will be stand up to the ATO, and at the same time is likely to be lower than the valuation as determined by the latest fundraising round. And the benefit to the employees in this scenario is, in general, I mean, we just spoke about all the different circumstances, but it's just generally a more favorable tax outcome for the employee if the tax basis on the equity that you're granting them is lower, generally speaking. Yeah. So then the other thing that from a practical standpoint, I wanted to kind of touch on was creating global equity plans that are nice and compliant for an Australian company. And again, what we kind of find is that moving off the startup concession, it's another great time to start up a new plan and really structure it for global expansion. And so in terms of how it's normally structured, is that it will be set up with the Australian rules, all about compliance in Australia, but there will be definitely an eye towards making it flexible to add sub-plans or addendums to the plan and offer letters to the plan to be able to issue equity from that same option pool to international employees. And so the kind of 3-step process that most of our customers would go through is, research and choose the plan, set it up for compliance, and then on an ad hoc basis for the employees that they do have, add the sub-plans and addendums and custom offer letters specific to those countries to allow them to issue equity compliantly and tax efficiently for those employees in those international countries. And so that's kind of the 3-step process. And then how Cake can help, and this is one of my favorite things about working at Cake, is that we've kind of gone out and done some of the heavy lifting for you. So Jack made a very good point around using free templates, say from the ATO or alternative sources, and it's just a bit of a trap for young players. So Cake's gone out. We've had lawyers draw up templates for specifically for other countries around the world that are going to be compliant and that can be easily insertable into a plan that you have developed and use on Cake. And so you're going to have the templates for your Australian company. That's kind of part and parcel, but Cake has offer letter templates for the USA, for Canada, for New Zealand and Philippines. And we maintain these to make sure that they're compliant and easily usable for you. And so expanding and issuing equity to those countries just becomes a lot easier for you with Cake. And then another advantage of our preferred partner network is that we have access to great professionals all over the world that that we can make introductions to give you templates, create templates for you specific to your company, for the UK, for Singapore, for Malaysia, Brazil. There's actually 20 other countries around the world, but these are some of the more common ones. And then one of the big questions that we have for companies going global is, hey, I went out, I did the right thing by the employees. I got an independent valuation for our Australian employees. It's nice and low, and still compliant. For our international employees, how are we going to determine the price on their equity for like the exercise price or the tax basis? Can we use the Australian valuation? And ultimately, it's going to depend on the countries. As an example, for your US employees, you'll still be required to get a Flora 9A valuation, which it's basically a very similar concept. It's to get an external party to do a valuation, but it will comply with the US tax code and allows you to set a real clear exercise price for the options. This is something that Cake can help with, and so you can actually do that all through the platform, which is really cool. And so in that answer, yeah, the Australian valuation won't be useful. In terms of the UK, we have a lot of customers with employees based in the UK. It's actually a bit more of an involved process where they actually have to, instead of just getting a third-party report and keeping it, and the tax department will ask you at a later date, do you have it? They actually have to apply the valuation, apply to the government to get it approved and to get the tax basis approved. And so, again, we have partners that can help you set up a plan for your UK employees. But it is useful using the Australian valuation report to send to them to give them a lot of context on the company and use it as a great jumping off point. And then the cool thing is there is a couple of countries around the world where they will accept the Australian valuation, depending on how it was written. But an example being New Zealand and Canada, and then to some extent Singapore would all accept it and would not require you to go out and get a third-party valuation, which is really cool. But then the asterisk there is double check that one because it's not a guarantee. But there is some value in the Australian valuation being used for your international employees, but just be aware there's extra rules. And then, how can Cake make the process easier? And so there's 3 different ways. One is through our preferred partner network introductions. These include to set up your and create your new plan. So Jack and Co can help you with that. We have other partners that can also help, and then specifically legal counsel. We can help in terms of getting the valuations done, not just the Australian ones, but also the international ones all over. And then we can also help in terms of introducing you to partner networks for generating the specific offer letter templates for your global employees, which is really cool. And then, of course, we have Cake, the equity management platform that brings this all together, allows you to issue out equity globally and to your Australian employees as part of a non-startup concession plan. And then the third value add is the ability to issue out the fact that we have these international templates. And we have access to partners who can provide international templates as well for pretty much most countries around the world where you will be looking to expand. And so, that's the kind of a practical guide as to putting it all together and implementing a non-startup concession plan for an Australian company. No longer enjoying all the benefits of the concession.
Thanks, Brandon, and thanks, Jack. A great content there to run through. I think there was a couple of questions there, so happy to actually open up questions and just run through some of those. We've got about another 10 minutes left. So, if anyone has any questions, feel free to just drop them in the chat now, and we can actually run through them.
So I can see one question. How do we value the shares or options from Ivan? Well, I'm going to give you the typical accountant/lawyer's answer. It depends. It depends on what type of scheme we're talking about. So if it's a startup concession, then potentially you could make use of what's known as the net tangible asset valuation methodology. It's known as a safe harbor type valuation, in that it's not a real valuation, but it is accepted by the ATO, right? So, you first need to ask yourself, what exactly do you need the valuation for? Do you need the valuation for commercial reasons? Or are you trying to value it to keep the taxpayer happy? If it's the latter, then for startup concessions, you can use the net tangible asset valuation. Now, if it's, for example, something like a limited recourse loan, what people typically use is the most recent cap raise, or some other methodology. Very rarely does a full valuation by a registered company valuer get commissioned. Okay. Obviously, there are valuers out there with that capability, including my partners, William Buck, but it's very rarely used, okay, because there's usually some kind of a shortcut. Now, when it comes to deferred taxation employee share option schemes, there is no particular tax requirement. Now, there might be a commercial requirement, in which case, the company can come up with a particular formula to value the current market value of the shares, or I could use the most recent cap raise. Okay, so this is what I most typically see in my day-to-day.
Right.
Okay.
Ivan also had a question about typical cost of engaging a lawyer to put it together. Jack, I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on the later stage.
Look, from what I see, a good lawyer that would do the job properly, they would charge typically in the region of $5,000 to $7,000 for a startup concession, for things like deferred tax ESOPs or limited recourse loans. It might be similar to that or a little bit more. So just be careful when someone charges you like $1,000 or $2,000. Usually, like I said before, you get what you pay for. But as Brendan has mentioned, Cake has come up with a sort of a technology solution to around this. So definitely explore that too.
Yeah, just to add to that, like we do get some really earlier stage companies who are actually, setting up for the first time. We do have some partners like Sprint Law, for example, who actually will do like a sort of lower cost, more fixed fee. But that's also, it's also important to understand with these things, there's actually it's about getting the right solution that actually fits where you are in your journey. And like for most really early stage startups, probably going and spending $5,000 to $7,000 setting up your ESS is a bit excessive. You don't probably need all that from day one. So you probably go with someone like a Sprint Law solution. But then as you actually start to get into later stage, you'll need a more sort of belts and braces approach. And that's where you actually want to make sure you're getting the right people. Whatever you do, don't go to someone who doesn't do this day in, day out. So the partners that we're going to connect you with, be it later stage, someone like a William Buck, or whether it be an early stage one where it's a bit more of a streamlined process, they are 100% going to be experts in actually dealing with startups, because you don't want a generalist lawyer trying to do this stuff for you when they know nothing about it, or an account for that.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree.
Yeah. Cool.
Good.
Jack, you spoke a little bit about it, but it's certainly something that I've seen, certainly play out in the US context. And I just, decisions around your taxing points and things like that, and what you actually do can make a big difference to outcomes. Like there's a partner of ours over there, Vince, that I've dealt with, and he was first 20 employee at Stripe and his first 5 at Brex, and they're 2 of the biggest fintech startups, successes globally. And, as he said to me, I've still got all my stock, right? Because he early exercised, so actually took the hit in terms of the actual income tax and then converted it into a capital gains, and actually did that. And interestingly, you don't see that's not really so much of an issue with obviously the startup concessions, because they're pretty treated from a capital perspective. But certainly as you move into this ESS realm, some of those decisions can have massive consequences for the actual wealth creation outcomes for individuals off the back of it. So it was great to see you going through that and actually explaining that in a little bit more detail, because I see it all the time just with people not being aware of what those implications are.
Yeah. And yeah, that's exactly right, Cal. Like, the reason we spent so long talking about tax is that tax tends to be the limiting factor. Okay. So obviously we need commercial considerations to create that alignment between company and individuals, but there are way more possibilities to achieve that goal than the number of solutions that work from a tax standpoint. So unfortunately, tax does tend to be the limiting factor, which means that we need to work within the more stricter framework imposed by tax. And as Cal has mentioned, the outcomes, the after-tax outcomes, can vary pretty significantly. And the way I describe it is that when tax is a percentage of something, then you don't have to be a mathematician to work out that very quickly that it could become a huge problem if the numbers are big.
Awesome. Brendan, anything else before we wrap up?
I do actually have a question for Jack.
Sure.
In terms of the different plans, so through Cake, we get all 5 of those come through. In terms of costs, is there kind of a lower cost one? Is the loan backed ESS has always seemed like a large beast for me. In terms of setting these up for companies, is there kind of a tier system in terms of cost and complexity?
Yeah, look, I'm only speaking in general terms because, each situation varies, but I would say startup concessions are quite simple. Loan back and deferred tax are probably the next level up in terms of complexity, because there's more moving parts. Okay. And then, the premium exercise price share options, they're probably in the same level as well. That second tier in terms of slightly higher complexity. But when it comes to things like, indeterminate rights, that's the next level up on top of that. That's significantly more complicated, both from a tax and legal and commercial standpoint as well. And there's also things we haven't discussed, like flowering shares, which people may have heard of and seen from time to time. It is quite uncommon, but it does get used. And once again, that is also quite up there in terms of complexity.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks, Brendan, for your time today. Thanks for everyone who attended. We'll also have this will be evergreen content, so you'll be able to access this. We'll send out the recording to you. You know where to. I think you got the QR code to actually reach out to Jack, and feel free to do that, and Brendan as well, or myself. If you have any other questions you need help with, please feel free to reach out. Really appreciate the content today. It's as you move beyond those startup concessions, it can get pretty complex, but there's no doubt that actually having your team engaged with the real ownership mindset is a really important ingredient in terms of your ongoing success. So great to see you guys explaining what are the different options that are available. And if anyone has questions, please feel free to reach out. Thanks again for your time today, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Cal. Thanks, Brendan. And thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers, everyone. Speak soon.
Bye-bye.